Hello and welcome to another video designed to get you the very top grades using just one quotation from Macbeth and matching it to every single kind of question you could get on the text, and then showing you how just revising these four themes will hit every single possible essay title. So your first question, and it's a really helpful one because it gives you more than one interpretation, and more than one interpretation puts you at grade 7 or above, is the dagger an apparition caused by Macbeth's mind, or is the dagger a supernatural element either placed there by the witches or placed there as a warning from God? Let's begin with the fact that Macbeth poses this as a question. Is this a dagger I see before me? So immediately he questions whether what he is seeing is real. And so our most obvious conclusion is that he knows this is produced by his own mind. Well, that's really useful to us because we can automatically use it to discuss his guilt. It means even before he kills Duncan, he realizes that his own sense of guilt is causing him to hallucinate, and he also realizes that killing the king is going to lead to the destruction of his own mind. And there's plenty in the play that shows that his own mind is deeply affected. For example, we can link it to his inability to sleep, how he imagines voices that tell him he will sleep no more, how he hallucinates Banquo's ghost. So it's easy to show that it has completely destroyed the credibility of his own mind, so he can no longer trust it. Obviously, we can use it to talk about the morality. This is his conscience talking to him, and he realizes when he sees the dagger that it's produced by his desire. It's making him want to kill Duncan, but it also appears as an apparition, as a warning to him that killing the king will be an illusory victory. It will appear real, but it won't. He won't be able to enjoy his kingship. So that actually takes us through those two themes of power and kingship already. We can delve a little deeper into power, because seizing the dagger allows him to seize power, but it also allows him to destroy that power for himself. You'll notice in the play that he never gets to enjoy the fruits of his kingship, and Lady Macbeth never gets to enjoy being queen. And so, if you like, the dagger that he uses to kill Duncan is also, metaphorically speaking, symbolically speaking, a dagger that he uses to destroy his own kingship. We can link it to the daggers that he actually uses to kill Duncan. Remember, he uses two, and he holds on to them and cannot bring himself to let go. Lady Macbeth has to take them back. So the dagger becomes symbolic of how he loses both his mind, but he also loses his power, and Lady Macbeth has to take charge. This is an upsetting of the natural order in Jacobean England. So we've linked it to how taking the dagger actually destroys his own enjoyment of his own kingship. Ultimately, it undermines his own kingship, and means that because he is taught bloody instruction by killing Duncan, it teaches others that it will be perfectly morally acceptable to kill him to replace him. We talked about how Lady Macbeth starts to assume power from this moment. He becomes helpless, unable to face his deed. He says that he doesn't dare go back and see what he has done, but she does. Also, that moment leads to her own destruction, because we can link that to her sleepwalking speech, where she can no longer remove the smell of blood. And this is the moment when she transferred that blood from Duncan to herself, when she took the real daggers. Clearly, we can use it to write about Macbeth and how this is the pivotal moment where he destroys his own happiness. Now we can think about the supernatural. So you can stage this so that the dagger is not a product of Macbeth's mind, but actually something planted there by the witches. It's easy to stage this by having the witches on stage, unseen by Macbeth, but seen by the audience, and then either a real dagger or an imaginary one in front of him to show the witch's control of his mind. Now, certainly that would be an interpretation that King James, author of Demonology, this great expert book on witchcraft, would definitely want to see in his play. Remember, this play is written to flatter King James, and it's a political manoeuvre on Shakespeare's part to get James to become his patron. So many contemporary members of the audience will choose to see this as a hallucination created by the evil satanic power of the witches and their supernatural influence over the once noble Macbeth. But Shakespeare is much more subtle than that, so he leaves it open to our interpretation. It could be a simple projection of his own guilt or his own sense of morality trying to prevent him from killing Duncan, and this could be what leads to the destruction of his mind, not the witches at all. As he says earlier, chance may have me king without my stir. You know, he notices that the witch's prophecies don't mean he has to do anything. He can just wait, like in fact Banquo does. So we can also use the appearance of the dagger to undermine a belief in the supernatural and promote the idea of just a psychological explanation for the dagger appearing. Remember, you get higher marks for considering both interpretations and then showing the examiner which one you prefer and why. Now, the dagger does point its way to Duncan, and there are a number of ways you can use it if you want to discuss Duncan. Firstly, Duncan confesses that there's no art to find the mind's construction in the face, and those appear wise words. You know, appearances are deceptive. However, he's been deceived twice. So the original Thane of Cawdor deceived him by becoming a traitor with the Norwegians, and now he makes Macbeth, the new Thane of Cawdor, who will also deceive him immediately by becoming a traitor and killing him. So a purely political interpretation of the play would suggest that as a king, Duncan actually deserves to lose his kingship. He's got this powerful weakness. His hamartia is that he underestimates the conspirators around him. He's not able to hold on to power, and that is a weakness in kingship. Kings, first and foremost, must be strong. Alternatively, you can look at the dagger as proof of Duncan's benevolence and innocence. If you think back to Macbeth's misgivings about killing Duncan, that soliloquy he has about how wonderful Duncan is and how the trumpet-tongued angels will, how his trumpet-tongued virtues will plead like angels. So he presents Duncan as a kind of saintly figure who does not deserve to die, and that is contrasted with the brutality of this bloody dagger that leads Macbeth towards Duncan. How could we use it to discuss Banquo? Well, it's quite interesting because Banquo received exactly the same prophecies as Macbeth. And remember, Macbeth had realised that these prophecies might come true without my stir. In other words, he did not have to clutch this dagger. He could have left it there. He could have chosen this moment not to kill Duncan, and he might still have become king later. And this is exactly the tactic that Banquo uses. He decides not to take any action whatsoever and just let things take their course. Crucially, he decides not to act to prevent Macbeth doing anything. We know that he is highly suspicious of Macbeth because we see him with his son Fleance and giving his son Fleance his sword. He makes sure that they're both armed even while the party at Macbeth's house, or castle I should say, is going on, even before Duncan is killed. He even tries to get Macbeth to talk about the weird sisters, saying that he dreamed of them last night. So we can infer from that that the witches have been acting on on Banquo's mind, or we might choose to see that Banquo hasn't really been thinking about the witches, or if he has, it's been his own planning rather than them having a supernatural influence over him. It's up to you to decide. But what's crucial is he knows that if he does something evil, the witches will confound him. He knows the instruments of evil want to do him harm, as he tells Macbeth. But he's also seen the evidence that Macbeth has become Thane of Cawdor, and similarly he seems to trust the witches' prophecies, and he knows that by doing nothing he will eventually give kingship to his son Fleance. Can we use it to write about Macduff? Well, this is the moment at which Macduff becomes his enemy. It's quite interesting that Duncan has asked Macduff to be the man to come and wake him, and not Macbeth, his host. What's even more interesting is that Macduff arrives from outside the castle. He has not been part of the celebrations. Either Macbeth has not invited him, or he has chosen to be absent. And this suggests that Duncan has had an unconscious sense that Macbeth is perhaps more treacherous than Macduff, and that Macduff is the more honest of the two, and this is why he symbolically chooses him for the more important role. It also suggests that Macbeth will unconsciously realise that Macduff is his greatest enemy, because Duncan has chosen him in this way, and because he has not appeared at Macbeth's feast. And consequently, this prepares us for the ending of the play, when Macduff turns out to be Macbeth's nemesis, his arch enemy, if you like, who eventually defeats him. So let's now see how what we've discussed fits the four big themes around Macbeth. We can see that this is a patriarchal society, and Macbeth's extreme form of masculinity has led to the tragedy of him choosing to commit regicide. So Shakespeare is criticising male power here because it shows that it leads to eventual destruction, not just of the king, but also many in the kingdom. However, Lady Macbeth's desire to acquire power through this violence also leads to her eventual destruction. She apparently commits suicide, and we see her losing her mind during the sleepwalking scene. So we can argue that Shakespeare thinks the patriarchal society itself is to blame. It's too male in nature and not feminine enough. It's out of balance. Or we can use it to discuss Christianity and the idea that you are punished for your evil deeds. So this is the moment when he sees the dagger that he decides to commit the most evil deed of killing the king. And this is also the time when the symbolic dagger appears, symbolically to destroy his mind. So he's punished here on earth. He gets no joy out of kingship. And then, of course, when he dies, he will, in the Christian tradition, go to hell. And what's interesting is Macbeth doesn't really mention hell. It doesn't seem to be a concern of his. He is very likely to be an atheist. However, Lady Macbeth is obsessed with the idea of going to hell. And Shakespeare does this in order to satisfy both audiences. His Christian audience, which will be by far the majority, and those who are much more interested in just the psychology of the individual, which will be a minority. But interestingly, in the modern day, that's most of us. Those roles have been reversed. Next, we need to look at the great chain of being. The idea that the king is appointed by God and rules by divine right. Well, you can easily see how the dagger is therefore a warning from God, if you like, that Macbeth is going to destroy the great chain of being, and therefore he will be punished by being destroyed himself. And this is why the dagger appears as a way to show that he's going to destroy his own mind and eventually his own happiness. And then finally we can link it to the idea of fate and destiny by showing that this is the moment that he embraces that fate. But it also suggests he had the opportunity not to. Now, in Greek tragedy, which introduced the rules of tragedy, introduced the idea of the tragic hero and of hamartia, the hero's fatal flaw. In Greek tragedy, no matter what the hero did, they could not escape their fate. And usually they'd find out their fate in advance, try and do lots of things to avoid it, and those very things led to that eventual destiny and their own destruction. So that was the irony deep in Greek tragedy. In Shakespeare's tragedy, it's much, much different. Here, the individual has the power to change their own fate. So, for example, Macbeth could have chosen to become king simply by waiting if the witches were correct, and that was his destiny. And then perhaps his kingship would have been a wonderful one. He would have enjoyed it. Lady Macbeth would have stayed alive because he would have acquired that kingship honestly. However, because he takes matters into his own hands, he changes that fate. He still becomes king, but he ruins that kingship for himself because of his hamartia. So Shakespeare places the role of the individual in a different relationship to their fate than the Greeks. Effectively, he offers them the opportunity of acting with free will, and as long as it's moral and in line with Christian tradition, he implies that they can succeed in life. And this is because, in Shakespeare's time, they believed in a benevolent God, one who was there to help mankind as long as they behaved in Christian and moral ways, whereas in Greek theatre, at that time they believed that there were competing gods, many of whom had different favourites among mortals, but they didn't ask mortals to behave in particularly moral ways, and they had no sense of providing justice to anyone. They simply meddled in human affairs according to their own passions and interests. Which brings us back to the supernatural and Hecate, where Shakespeare invites us to imagine that perhaps supernatural powers are playing with Macbeth for their own amusement, and that idea is one that comes from ancient Greek tragedy. So there you go, that ability to write about tragedy as a construct and a literary tradition will propel you at least to grade 7, and I hope you've seen yet again how one quotation can have the superpower of being so useful that it fits any question. There will be 10 of these in the series, and then I shall start making videos putting all 10 quotations together and showing you how they will construct any essay. Well, don't forget to subscribe if you want more. Give me some comments if there are ways to improve my video, and see you soon on my channel. Goodbye.